World War I began, and the major European powers entered the war. Millions were killed and wounded. Even Italy, which had been neutral, joined the war on the side of the Allies to gain some advantages. In this episode, we will continue our coverage of World War I. In May 1915, the Germans launched a major offensive into Polish territory under Russian control, known as the Gorlice-Tarnow operation. The Germans captured Warsaw, forcing the Russian army to retreat. This was a significant victory for Germany. Several weapons made their first appearance in the war, reflecting technological and scientific advancements at the beginning of the 20th century. Poison gases were used, and tanks appeared on the battlefield for the first time, with the British being the first to use them. Balloons and airplanes were also used for reconnaissance and bombing. Submarines were used to attack ships, and advanced machine guns and heavy artillery were employed. These weapons caused countless casualties, in addition to men who suffered permanent disabilities. The war turned into a protracted trench war. The situation was difficult. The trenches were infested with rats, and soldiers could not bathe for long periods. Soldiers relieved themselves in the trenches, and none of them dared to risk their lives by even sticking their heads out of the trench. From December 1915, the Allies intensified their efforts, holding numerous meetings to coordinate a powerful and effective strike against Germany. From the beginning of 1916, France and Britain led several battles that changed the course of World War I. On February the 21st, the Germans launched a large-scale attack at Verdun, led by Crown Prince Wilhelm. The aim of this operation was to inflict the greatest possible losses on the French army and force it to surrender or open the way to Paris. The human losses were huge on both sides, as the Germans lost about 300,000 men, while the French lost 315,000 men. The French general Philippe Pétain believed that a defensive plan should be followed, so he ordered the continuation of trench warfare and the attrition of the German army. His plan succeeded in repelling the aggression and stopping the Germans, so he later became known as the hero of Verdun. With the beginning of World War I, balloons and airplanes were used for reconnaissance and monitoring enemy movements, but in 1915, machine guns were attached to airplanes and they were used as fighter planes. During the war years, these fighter aircraft were developed and used extensively in the Battle of Verdun. Fierce aerial battles took place between German and French pilots. Several fighter pilots became famous during the war, the most famous being the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, a German pilot of noble birth, who shot down 80 aircraft. He was followed by the French pilot René Fontanet, who shot down 75 aircraft in between July 1, 1916, and November 18, 1916. The Battle of the Somme took place between Germany and the Allies near the Somme River in France. The objective of this operation was to relieve pressure on the Verdun front, break through the German defensive lines, and open the road to Berlin. The Allies began with a massive artillery attack, but the attack failed miserably, and Britain suffered the greatest losses in its military history in a single day. Tanks were used for the first time in history in that battle, which later turned into trench warfare. On April 16, 1917, the French launched a fierce attack on the Germans in what became known as the Nivelles Offensive, in the Chemins-de-Ram region of northern France. The French, led by Robert Nivelles, aimed to break through the German defense lines and recapture some lost territory. However, the French attack failed, and mutinies and sit-ins broke out within the French army after the battle. A large number of casualties were suffered, but without any real progress. In Germany, food became scarce, and with the harsh conditions of war and malnutrition, diseases spread, and anger intensified. In February 1917, the Russian Revolution erupted, forcing the Tsar to abdicate and placing him under house arrest. He sought asylum in London, but his departure was delayed due to his sons contracting measles. King George V of Britain feared the impact of the Russian Revolution on his country, so he left his cousin, the Tsar of Russia, to face his fate alone. The Tsar's family moved several times until Bolshevik guards decided to kill the Tsar and his family members in cold blood. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government, and the Soviet Union was later established in 1922. Communism emerged and remained a rival to capitalism throughout the 20th century. On November 21st, 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria died after ruling the country for more than 6 decades. He was succeeded by Karl I, a warrior who realized that the country was on the verge of collapse. Half the army had been destroyed, and the country had lost hundreds of thousands of men in the war, in addition to civilian casualties and dire economic conditions. Several attempts were made to impose peace and end the war, but it failed because all sides were determined to maintain their gains, and epidemics and famines spread throughout Europe. European monarchs and leaders feared the Russian Revolution would spread to their countries. In 1917, Germany adopted a new tactic: submarine warfare. German submarines attacked all British ships in the Pacific Ocean, both warships and merchant vessels. The aim of these attacks was to cut off Britain's supply lines and force its surrender. However, this strategy changed the game. The United States, which had remained neutral since the beginning of the war, was forced to enter the conflict because the British merchant ships attacked by German submarines were carrying Americans. There were other reasons as well. Britain and France were obligated to repay enormous sums of money they had borrowed from the United States, and if the Allies lost the war, they would not be able to repay these loans. The United States was also a major exporter of grain and raw materials to those countries, which helped boost the American economy. The major blow came when the British intercepted a message from Germany to the Mexican government. Germany was inciting Mexico to attack the United States, promising to assist the Mexican government in the war to reclaim the territories the United States had seized from Mexico. Therefore, in April 1917, U.S. President Wilson declared war on Germany, and the United States joined the Allies. Following the U.S. declaration of war, French General Joseph Joffre paid an official visit to the United States to coordinate cooperation between France and the United States in the war. Joffre was warmly received by the Americans, and attended several meetings with American leaders. Throughout the country, calls for military service were issued. The American military industry was not as advanced as it is today, and the army was small and poorly trained. But the problem was the German U-boats, which would attack any Allied ship. How would these forces reach Europe safely? Nevertheless, the American expedition arrived in France on June 26, 1917, to support the Allies in the war. The commander of the American forces was General John Pershing, a prominent American general known as Blackjack. Upon the expedition's arrival in France, Pershing and his men received a grand welcome. The American general refused to integrate his forces with the French and British armies, and insisted on an independent American army. The American army needed more equipment to fight, so the American government was forced to promote the purchase of American bonds to support the army. On the other hand, arms factories in Europe were working day and night, and famine spread in Britain. The German U-boats had cost Britain dearly, so Britain resorted to the naval blockade plan. This plan relied on gathering merchant ships in large groups and protecting them with warships. This plan succeeded in reducing losses. On July 31, 1917, Britain launched a strong attack on the Germans in Ypres, northern Belgium. The battle began with heavy artillery bombardment, and the British advanced with their tanks. However, the rains turned the soil into a swamp, hindering the tanks' movement and making them easy prey for the Germans. Nothing new to report in this bloody war. Both sides suffered heavy losses without any real progress. Although the Allies captured the village of Passchendaele after bloody battles, they were unable to open the road to the coast completely. Going back to May 1915, Italy launched a strong attack on the Trento region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Italian army suffered in this attack due to the bad weather and the rugged terrain. The Austrians were also very well fortified. On the other hand, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. The Germans had devised a clever plan to halt the war on the Eastern Front and focus on the Western Front. They supported Lenin, who was opposed to the war, and transported him in an armored train from Switzerland to Russia. In October 1917, Lenin led the Bolshevik Revolution, overthrowing the provisional government. On March 3, 1918, Russia signed an agreement with Germany, ceding part of its territory in exchange for a ceasefire on the Eastern Front. Thus, Russia withdrew from the war. Germany achieved its primary objective, avoiding fighting on two fronts. Therefore, German commanders quickly devised a plan for a swift and surprise attack on the Western Front to decisively win the battle. The Germans advanced rapidly towards Paris under air cover, with Goth bombers relentlessly bombing French cities, especially Paris. People rushed to shelters with every air raid siren. In April 1918, the Allies agreed to appoint French General Ferdinand Foch as supreme commander of the Allied forces. Plans were drawn up for a counterattack against the German army, coordinated between the Allied countries, which later led to the defeat of Germany and the end of the war. On the other hand, the Allies also bombed German cities, and fierce air battles took place between the Allies and Germany. Between 1918 and 1920, a dangerous epidemic struck the world, claiming millions of victims from all over the world. This epidemic directly affected the course of World War I. It was the Spanish flu. It was named as such because the Spanish Free Press was the first to report on it. The epidemic was kept secret throughout Europe due to the war, but it was deadly. Around a third of the world's population contracted the Spanish flu. On the front lines, there were no more men left on the battlefield. Those who hadn't been killed or wounded in battle were swept away by the flu, and hospitals overflowed with soldiers. As the fighting continued, the German General Hindenburg was forced to call up troops from the hospitals. In June 1918, the first clashes between the American and German armies took place. The Americans proved their fighting prowess in this battle. Pershing was eager for open warfare, away from the trenches, and didn't want to risk his soldiers either. The Americans attacked and captured some German fortifications. General Ludendorff had no choice but to launch a large-scale and decisive attack against the Allies in what became known as the Second Battle of the Marne. The major offensive began in July 1918 to break the French lines and capture Paris. The Germans employed shock tactics, launching a swift and surprise attack. However, the German army was demoralized and exhausted, while the Allied forces, under General Foch, launched a well-organized counterattack with significant American participation. The German army retreated, and this was the last major German offensive of the war on the Western Front. Meanwhile, in 1916, in the Hejaz, the Great Arab Revolt began. It was initiated by Prince Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca, who fired a shot from the balcony of his palace. Arab forces sought to overthrow Ottoman rule over the Arab lands with the help of European powers, represented by Thomas Lawrence. The Arab forces, led by Prince Faisal bin Hussein, entered Damascus on October 1, 1918. After the war, the Ottoman Empire's lands were divided between France and Britain, and the Allies reneged on their promises to the Arabs, who received only a small amount of land, though it was rich in resources and wealth. On December 9, 1918, British forces entered Jerusalem, and the Ottoman forces withdrew after more than 400 years of control. What further fueled the resentment among Arabs and Muslims was the allocation of a portion of Palestinian land to the Jews as a prelude to the establishment of a Jewish state on the Holy Land of Palestine. Back in Europe, the Allies launched massive attacks along the entire front, and some German battalions surrendered. Revolution swept across Germany. Everyone was demanding an end to the war. In late 1918, Wilhelm II traveled to Belgium to assess the situation on the front, but the army was collapsing due to the recent Allied offensives. On November 9, 1918, Wilhelm II decided to abdicate due to internal unrest, and the Allies refused to negotiate with him. The German emperor then fled to the Netherlands, where he lived out the rest of his life until his death in 1941. Some military leaders believed that the reason for Germany's defeat in the war was the political leadership, which had failed them, not the army. There was a young corporal in the army who was among the most resentful of the political leadership because of the defeat. This young man's name was Adolf Hitler, a name that would later become synonymous with dictatorship and tyranny throughout history. At 11 a.m. on November the 11th, the armistice agreement between Germany and the Allies was signed in a railway carriage in the Campine Forest, a location that would later become a symbol and a legend. On December the 13th, 1918, U.S. President Wilson arrived in Paris to attend the Paris Peace Conference, which was part of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was signed in the famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. The Germans viewed the treaty as a document of humiliation under the guise of peace. It fueled resentment and anger among the German people, and paved the way for the rise of short-mustached monster Adolf Hitler to power. The most important clause Wilson proposed was the right to self-determination, which led to the establishment of independent states. The principle was that people should be able to determine their own destiny. After all the suffering and destruction, the world changed, and the world became different. The world was no longer the same. The League of Nations was established, from whose womb the United Nations was born, to prevent future wars. After the war, humiliating conditions were imposed on Germany, as its colonies outside Europe were divided between France and Britain. Part of its territory was cut off. Most of the German army officers and soldiers were discharged, military factories were closed, and Germany was forced to pay exorbitant reparations to France. As for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was dismantled, and many countries became independent. Austria was recognized with its new borders, after many countries separated from the empire. The Second World War began here, from that treaty, from the Hall of Mirrors in Paris.